First of all, I'll welcome you to the Winter 2023 Ariscraft Canada Brick Speaker Series, which is named the Praxes of Care. Tonight's theme is landscape stories. And I'd like to first say thank you to all of you, the audience, for showing up tonight, even despite that this event was rescheduled. There's a wonderful crowd. I can see, it's a really great way to end our Praxes of Care 2-year speaker series. So thank you. And first, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we are on. Oops, pardon me. We are located on the traditional lands of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The first people encountered by settlers were the Chalundun people of the Deer, or peaceful Iroquoians. Their neighbors were the neutral and Petun peoples, along with the Hurons further north, and south, the Anishinaabe Mississaugas. The university where we gather today is situated on the Haldimand Tract. This was land that was granted to the Mohawk of the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. And this was in 1794. The Six Nations people came here in exile from their traditional lands in New York State and are currently our neighbors on this site. And I'd like to thank Bill Woodworth, whose words I have in part echoed tonight in preparing this land acknowledgement. The series Praxes of Care is dedicated to Andrew Levitt, who taught at Waterloo for 3 decades and passed away a little over a year ago. Andrew taught with care and about care, providing students with tools to cultivate well-being and to practice architecture in a more caring way. So it's within this context that our lecture series asks, what is an architecture of care? I'd like to thank the planning committee, Adrian Blackwell, Jalia Fonseca, Mary Paul McDonald, Beth Vince, Wendy Wan, Joel Wan, and Victor Zagabe, and also to Mayuri Paranthahan and Brenda Reed. Thank you as well to Julia Nakanishi for designing our wonderful poster, and also to Ariscraft Canada Brick for funding this lecture series. We don't have a moderator tonight. So this is normally the time that I would hand the event over to the moderator. And this is because we had originally invited Andrew Judge to act as moderator. And because we had to change the event time, Andrew was unable to join us tonight. What I'd like to do, and because this is the last event in the lecture series, I'd like to extend the moderator position to all of us as a community and to really ask you to think about how you might act in that capacity as a moderator, all of us together, so that we can have this experience of kind of storytelling and community together amongst ourselves. What I will do is I will introduce the speakers and then we'll move on to our conversation. Jane Wolfe studies, draws, and writes about the complicated landscapes that emerge from interactions between natural processes and cultural interventions. Her goal is to make these difficult and often contested places legible to the wide range of audiences with a stake in the future. Jane is a professor at the University of Toronto Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design, and the recipient of the 2022 Margulies National Design for Living Prize. Jane was the co-curator with Susan Schwarzenberg of the Toronto Landscape Observatory, an installation and program series designated to help visitors to the 2022 Toronto Biennale of Art recognize, acknowledge, and understand their own roles in the city's ecosystem. Her publications include Bay Lexicon, Delta Primer, a field guide to the California Delta, Landscape Citizenships, co-edited with Tim Waterman and Ed Wall, and the Gutter to Golf website, co-authored with Elise Shelley and Derek Hufferlin. Our other speaker tonight is Jennifer Wemigwans. Jennifer Wemigwans is a PhD. She is from Wickwaniquam, unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, Ontario. Jennifer is a new media producer, a writer and scholar specializing in the convergence between education, Indigenous knowledge, and new media technologies. Jennifer's book, A Digital Bundle, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge Online from 2018, explores the prospects of Indigenous knowledge education and digital projects in a networked world. Dr. Wemigwans takes pride in working to invert the conventional use of media by revealing the potential for Indigenous cultural expression and Indigenous knowledge through new technologies, education, and the arts. She is an assistant professor in the Adult Education and Community Development Program at OISE, University of Toronto. So thank you. Turn it over to Jane and Jeff.
How's the sound? It's okay? Great. Well, thank you for this invitation, for this very kind introduction, for coming tonight. It feels like a real gift to be here with you on the banks of the river. I'm thrilled and honored. And I also want to say a special miigwech to my friend and colleague Jennifer for the gift of many, many conversations that got us here today. And now we'll see if I can manage to advance two computers at the same time. All right. What are practices of care and landscapes? I think they're tied to a sense of belonging to a place, to all the beings and phenomena that make up that place, and to all the other people who care about that place. Belonging's a process. I think it's a process of sharing stories about landscapes, about their meanings, and about their possibilities. And I use those words in the plural because many different stories about the same place can be true at the same time. And I've thought for a long time about observing as a practice of care, an engaged process of seeking out stories about places for sharing. Let's see. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how those ideas came forward in a project called the Toronto Landscape Observatory not quite a year ago. It was a collaborative project with the Toronto Biennial of Art in a space that was right beside the West Toronto rail path. That's a kind of strange place in the city. I don't know how well people know Toronto, but it was long hidden from many people's consciousness by industry. And it's now one of the sites of intense change in Toronto as the neighborhood's being redeveloped for housing. So what you're seeing here is both the rail line, the freight line still, and GO line and UP lines, and then also a photograph of the rail path itself. It was the product of citizen activism in the early 2000s, a reimagined space that was left over as the rail corridor became less busy. And it was taken up by the city as part of its bike path, opened in 2009, and now it's both marginal in a way, but very central to the people who use it and love it. And the observatory was right beside the rail path, just actually on the other side of the building wall in the photograph that's on your left. It was in a place, it was an installation and a collection of things to help people look at landscapes. But what was most important is that it was a series of conversations. And because of the biennial and because of the generous funding of SSHRC, I had the pleasure of convening an amazing collection of interlocutors and the pleasure and gift of their conversations over the better part of a year as we got ready for the biennial. And as the convener, I also had the pleasure of working on a vocabulary that would help to bring together all the thoughts and insights and stories that had been shared as we got ready. So I'll show you just a little bit of that work. Um, Here is one of the most important things, I think, in the installation. It was a collection of questions for observers, engaged observers from all the people who had worked to prepare the observatory. And the ambition was really to share ideas and frameworks for learning to know the place. And I think it's useful to remember that a question is actually a very powerful tool for engaged observing. A little bit more about where the rail path is. I'm hoping you can see it. It's a little dot. It says 72 Perth. And it's, as I said, a part of the town that's off the mental map of a lot of people because of its place along the rail corridor. As you can see in the map, it's on a ridge. The ridge divides two watersheds, and the ridge explains the location of the colonial rail line that still connects Toronto's harbor to its hinterland. And you can see in that roughly east-west rail line, just to the north of where we were, that there's an escarpment. That escarpment marks the shore of Lake Iroquois, which was the parent lake of Lake Ontario, from the time when the ice sheets began to retreat and before what we now know as the St. Lawrence had opened up to the sea. And this map is part of an atlas, one of the contributions to the observatory by Aaron Hernandez that use cartography and cross-section to visualize policies that underlie the city's contemporary form. So I got to, because of the conversations we had about Aaron's work, we had collectively, I got to think to myself, what does a ridge do? A ridge sheds water and keeps places high and dry. And Aaron had showed us our ridge and the waterways that divided at the scale of the city. But then right there on the rail path was, at the scale of the body, a ridge that lets people take a walk on a rainy day. We met every Sunday for 6 weeks, sometimes sitting down, sometimes on foot. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is James Bird sharing stories about the Dene language and how it connects him to his homeland and to all the beings of that land. What you're seeing on the right is a walk that Susan Schwarzenberg and I led in which we asked our companions to talk about what they saw, heard, found, felt, thought, wondered. Many of the walks and conversations produced broadsides that were instructions or thought guides so that people who came on different days could also follow along with the wondering and the inquiring of the people who were part of our group. And we always asked the people who joined us to record what had meaning for them and to add it to the installation. So here you're seeing our amazing mobile observatory designed by Joel Robson and Alex Moyle and built by Joel. And then on the other side, some of the things that people left with us about what they had seen, felt, thought, heard, wondered. This was a listening walk in which Sherry Lee and Emily McCallum asked us to notice the sounds of the rail path and also to make sounds ourselves. An interesting invitation to think about listening as a process and about the body as a tool for measuring and registering sounds that tell us where we are in the world. Alex Moyle created tools and led a workshop to calculate the proportion of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that are embodied in a single leaf and then released on combustion at a much more expanded rate than it can be sequestered. A really amazing way of understanding how carbon sequestration works at the scale of a single leaf or a single person. And that seemed like an invitation to think, well, what is a leaf anyway? It's not just a thing, it's a site of exchanges and processes. Lorraine Johnson took us on a walk to greet plants, to spend time with them, to talk to them, to register our connections and affinities to them. And that posed a really beautiful reminder of our relationships to all the human and more than human beings in the landscape, and a reminder that any old walk is a chance to encounter and acknowledge and articulate those relationships with respect and kindness to build a sense of belonging. And here are Jacques Lavallee and Jennifer. Grandmother Jacques was able to bring us together through ceremony, and that ceremony was in relationship to the augmented reality teaching she was working on with Jennifer. And it's important to note that that ceremony brought us together into the circle to acknowledge all of our relations. And then we were invited to view a small segment of the AR teaching, which was still at that time in production. And so you can see everyone looking at their phones and seeing both the landscape we were standing in and also the landscape of the teaching.
So it's kind of fitting to think about, what does it mean when you launch a project, right? And when is a project ready to be given a life? And when is it ready to be given over to, I guess, a public kind of venue offered as a sharing? And so it's today, what I decided to do for this talk in particular was actually publicly launch Wendigo. So this augmented reality, it's an AR teaching that was that I worked with Dr. Golkamis, grandmother Jacques Lavallee. And to kind of just provide a little background and context, how it came about was I wanted something particular to that rail path when Jane had invited me to be a part of the biennial. And so I asked Dr. Golkamis, Jacques Lavallee, if she would come with me to look at the space. And I was really thinking about how our elders and knowledge keepers really have those landscape stories. And so she came down there and we were walking and I was asking her, so, what are you thinking? And she told me all kinds of stories. She remembered even being in that neighborhood when she was a child. And so we were talking about just her experiences. And then she recalled exactly what Jane was showing you earlier in terms of the map, the ice ridge. And she started telling me the story of her grandmother sharing with her the story of the great ice, the ice ridge that existed in that part of the land and territory of Toronto. And I found that really interesting because we were standing there and she was just kind of like so many elders and knowledge keepers will do, like engaging physically, showing me with her hand where that ridge was. And the story was so dramatic, what it would have meant and looked like in terms of looking up and seeing something that was like the height of a building and even taller. And so it was really impactful to be with her. And so when I talked to her about, could we work together to create this augmented reality piece, I explained to her how it's using a phone and how you can take a story and show an image through the phone and be able to have it right on the land in the space that you are, standing in and hear that teaching. And she was quite intrigued by it. And I think she was also intrigued because she was familiar with my work, fourdirectionsteachings.com, which was launched in 2006. It's an interactive website, and it was one of the first sites to really put Indigenous knowledge teachings on the internet. And so if you haven't seen that site, it's kind of in a holding pattern pattern right now because we're going to be redeveloping it into HTML5, but it is workable in terms of a format if you want to see that. But thinking about this, what is an architecture of care? I was looking at the themes and I noted how there was attention, action, communication, and maintenance. And I thought about how when we did this project at the Biennale with Jane, how she had let us come in and do the kind of praxis of care that we needed to do for the project. And that was to enact ceremony. So in enacting ceremony, I want to share with you a definition by Dr. Reg Croshu. He's Pekani Blackfoot, and he calls it vows. And it's just interesting because when you think of the themes that were, I would assume, written by Tara Bissett or the whole committee, lovely. So with vows, it's really interesting because Dr. Reg Croshu talks about venue, so place, action, language, and song. And so just to look at that and think about the action and communication, right? So there's definitely something. So thinking about that, when we did that ceremony, I also want to just point out that doing that, when Jane talks about observing with a practice is a practice of care, I think that observing is also a slow observation of time. And I want to point that out because I felt so supported by Jane when she said, I told her, I don't think the project's going to be ready. We're not done. We're still, in development mode. And I don't think we should be there. We're not ready. And Jane said, you just take whatever time you need. Like don't rush it, just take the time you need. And I really appreciated that because then I was able to talk to grandmother Jacques and ask her, well, what do you think we need to do? And she said, let's use that space. Let's use that generosity of space and time to launch the project in a good way. Let's do ceremony. And so within Indigenous understandings of bringing a project to life, it's often done through ceremony. And so it was just really beautiful that we could bring the fire and that we had, Gokamis Jacques Lavalley with her drum, and she did some songs, and there was smudge was shared and medicines were lit. And it was really beautiful way of bringing to life this AR project. And so afterwards, we were able, as you saw in the picture before, to show just one segment of the 4-segment piece because that's all we had done. We were able to accomplish at that time. But I think it's quite interesting that, again, with the observation of time as a slow process and building a good relationships and understanding that everything that you create and make has its own life cycle. It has its own way of developing and moving through the world. That when Jane said, would you join me in Waterloo to talk about this project, I was like, I'm going to launch the project at Waterloo because Jane will be there. And Jane was the one who kind of facilitated the space. So yeah, I'm happy to share that, so this is the part where we were talking about the ceremony, but I'm happy to share that the project is available right now at invertmedia.com. So that's my kind of like working website. But when to go, there is the link. You can actually go to it and see it. But what I would recommend for people to do is to view this teaching, you need to click on the link, and you have to have a smartphone for people who don't know what AR is. And I would really ask you to please view outside and to face north, because if you're facing north, you're respecting the order, like the direction of the teachings. And also for the best experience, if you could wear headphones, and remember that as you're moving around back and forward, that it changes the size and the graphics. So to keep that in mind. But what this teaching is really about. It's a 5-minute AR teaching, and you will experience 4 short sequences that will share a teaching of Wendigo, the ice, right? This ice ridge that Dr. Gokamis-LaValle saw when she was on that rail path and remembered that teaching. And so you'll learn about the Ice Age in Toronto. And one of the most important messages in that teaching is about kindness, and how it's kindness that is our connection to land, to the climate, and to each other. And so I'm just going to back up here for a minute. Yeah, so here you can see that on the day that we were actually, as we said, like a little less than a year ago, Elder Gokamis Jacques-LaValle, who's from Shawanaga First Nation, she was the elder who shared the teaching, but she's also the narrator. We actually got her into a studio to narrate the teaching, which was quite lovely. And Dr. Hopi Lavelle Martin was at the actual ceremony at the Biennale, and he's the ceremonial helper for Elder Gokamis-LaValle. And then myself, I like to use the Indigenous designation, which would be helper, as opposed to producer, but a helper for the AR project. And Luke Garwood was our hybrid media designer and programmer, and James Rohr was the sound designer and composer. And I really encourage you to have those headphones on because the soundscape is so beautiful. Michelle Robert did a lot of the graphic design, and then we also had support from Winston Bromley and Emma Westacott. So I don't know, I think I've covered about as much as I wanted to share in terms of this project, and how, you know, when I reflect on what is a praxis of care, I can tell you that it's central to the architecture of digital technology. And that's because when you start with the project and you're working with elders and knowledge keepers, it's always in support relationship. You're always following those protocols of the community. You're following their protocols as an elder and knowledge keeper. And when we're creating these digital bundles, so this AR project, like 4directionsteachings.com, is a digital bundle. It's designated as that because they are Indigenous knowledge bundles that are shared through new technology, right? So hence the digital bundles. But in doing that, you really have to employ all of the protocols. And one of those very important protocols is ceremony, right? So we brought the project to life over a year ago, but today we're actually offering it as a gift to everyone. Miigwech.
A question. We haven't seen, I mean, you're just launching the project here tonight, and we haven't seen it. I guess we don't have our, not very many people have their smartphones out or not looking at it. I was wondering if you would be willing to take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about what we will see or what we will experience when we kind of open the app. Thank you.
Yeah. So with AR projects, you're going to see an object in the real space that you're in. And I guess it would be helpful to note a few things that are done in terms of interface design on purpose. So I tried to, as a helper, utilize the screen space and pay attention to directions. So because we're talking about Grandmother Moon, when you go and look at this piece outside, you're going to see a circle in the top left corner of your screen, and it'll have a little play button to indicate, please click here and play. So once you hit that button, it will start. And they're very short sequences because we have to remember, like, what can people actually feel comfortable with different types of technology. And then after that piece is done, another, it doesn't show up as a circle. It has to do with loading. These are all tech issues, but it shows up as a big black square. But that'll show up in the right hand upper left of your screen. And when you click on that, then the interface will come on as a circle and you'll get the other part of the teaching. Again, that is done strategically because that side coming up in the, if we're thinking about it, you're thinking north, south, east, west, the sun rises in the east. So when we're talking about that in the top right screen, that's kind of like the eastern direction. And then the third spot that comes up after you hear that teaching that contextualizes the work that the sun did in the story of Wendigo, you see a huge black, again, holding screen, but when you click it, it will go into the circle of the ice, and it's kind of taking up the whole screen on purpose. The idea is so that you feel overwhelmed by the image, that you can really hear the story of how terrifying ice was. And then after that sequence, there's another, the fourth and last sequence will be in the center, and then that's the ending piece. So yeah, so that's kind of what an AR experience will be like. It is, I'm going to have to finesse because we're still thinking about, so I've got the idea of like, when you go to the website to have those directions like, please be outside, please face north. But I think I'm going to have to indicate that, yeah, this was done for the territory or space in Toronto, because I don't quite know how far did that ice ridge run? I don't, do you know? Yeah, so let Jane.
I know where we can find out. Yeah, we can look at Coleman's map, I think from 1932, and it tracks the ice ridge all the way along along southern Ontario. Yeah.
So would that mean that the ice ridge for this territory, like for people who are looking, standing in Cambridge looking north, that the ice ridge could have come out this far?
Good question. I think we have to, let's look at the map.
Okay. So consider that, look at the map if you can, and then try to imagine if that story applies here. But yeah, that's something else I'll have to contextualize. Does that answer your question, Tara?
And I can, Tara, I'll send you the Coleman map or where to find it. Okay.
I guess a question that I have is, I'm really interested in, I mean, this is our second year of having talks that have all been kind of reflecting on this idea of care. And I actually work on a kind of historiography of care myself. And it's been very interesting to me to see how people approach the topic in so many very different ways. And partly, I think it has to do with the nebulousness of care, that it means something different to all of us. But one thing that I've seen that is sort of a through line, or it's consistent, is this sort of importance of reciprocity, that care is it's a reciprocal act. And it's really interesting that you've been talking about storytelling, for instance. And for the very first time, it's occurred to me that inherent in storytelling, just like in care, is this nature of reciprocity, right? That there's, you're telling the story with people, to people. And I thought that it was really interesting to see the process at which you kind of unveiled this project and talking about the questions. This idea that even in your methodology or your method, your way, your process, that this importance of engaging the people who are coming to the project with questions at the outset. It sort of lays the groundwork for a kind of a sort of reciprocity, this, working together. I also really thought that it was it's really interesting the way you talked about, I mean, there's a sort of temporal, something very interesting about the time at play. I mean, not only in the sort of digital project, but also when you were talking about the rail path, and this sort of slowing down of time. And I wonder if many of us can probably relate to that. I mean, maybe through COVID, I know there were times when we couldn't take fast transportation. We were walking around, and I know I have entered into a different relationship myself with my own neighborhood. And to me, it was a real slowing down, you know, and it really was so interesting how it's reflected in your talk tonight, you know, when it becomes this impetus for asking new questions, like what is a ridge? What is a leaf? And what are not only what is it sort of ontologically, but how does it in itself afford these processes or a kind of reciprocity? And so, I mean, I think to me, it's very interesting to just think about this nature of our relationships, you know, and how important that is in this practice of care. With that in mind, I think what I'd like to ask you about is your relationship in this process and how you came to work on this together. And maybe just I'd like to ask you to unearth some of the processes at play in your own the practice that you know how you work together.
Well, not that long ago, and in a galaxy not that far away. Let's say maybe I don't even know, like maybe about 5 or 6 years, I think, maybe 6 in Toronto. Some people from the city of Toronto asked if I would help them think about a project that they imagined to be like Mannahatta for Toronto. Does everybody know Mannahatta, that longitudinal GIS project about Manhattan that imagines the island of Manhattan before colonial contact? Is this something people know about, by Eric Sanderson? It's an interesting project. And when it came out maybe 10 or 12 years ago, it was pretty radical. Someone was doing that kind of intense historical research to try to create a digital resource that people could have access to understand the history of Manhattan Island. And it seemed to me that it was also a very problematic project for a lot of reasons that I won't tell you about. But for one reason, this is actually what brought me to know Jennifer. It did not include any Indigenous voices. And what I said to the people of the city was, actually, you know, I'm a settler, I'm an immigrant citizen of Canada. My goal is to be a good treaty person, and I can't even begin to think about this project until we have an Indigenous partner who can guide us. You know, that's it. So then, luckily for me, a friend named Allison, who also worked in the city, was talking about it with me, and she said, "Oh, I think maybe my friends Jennifer and Doug might be interesting people to talk to." So turns out that's how I met Jennifer and Doug, and they were really interesting to talk to about it. And so that's kind of how we went forward. We got a sort of seed grant from the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation that would allow Jennifer to do research with elders to think about framing a project like that. And maybe Jennifer got something we would talk about. And then meantime, I'll say from my side that our conversations were so full of life and insight and joy, really, that I thought, okay, well, I'm going to really try to know this person. And when the opportunity arose to work with the biennial, I thought, okay, I've got to persuade her to be part of this adventure. So that's, I guess that's how my version of how we got to know each other.
Yeah. I think that you know, the idea of many cups of tea is so important as a methodology for building good relationships in community. And so sitting with Jane and talking about the Toronto Mapping Project and doing community-based meetings with other people who were working on mapping projects in the city was really insightful. And one of the first projects meetings that we had where there were non-Indigenous and Indigenous people at the table sitting and talking about what it means to map Toronto was really interesting, because you could see that there was this idea of like non-Indigenous people thinking about the Manhattan Project. Like, yeah, we can map time, and we can map processes, and we can map territories, and we can map the waters, and we can map, the vegetation and the animals and what moved through what, period of time. And it was all very linear. And it was so interesting because when you listen to the Indigenous people at the table, they were talking about clans, families, kinship ties. They were talking about responsibility for the different elements that, run through the territory, the water, the land. And it was really something where when I went to go and consult elders and knowledge keepers about the Toronto Mapping Project, I soon found out that there cannot be at this time an Indigenous perspective on the territory of Toronto, because there is just too many different epochs of time, right? So are you talking about the time of the Haudenosaunee? Are you talking about the time of the Anishinaabe? Which time period are you talking about? Because there's so much that so many stories and relationships and movement and community movement. And we started to realize that after talking with the elders and knowledge keepers, that it's really thinking about council fires. It's really thinking about relationships between the various nations that have all moved within and through Toronto. So it's been really great, because I think with Jane, we are just constantly dialoguing and having these cups of tea and processing. And, I've been reading her work on the Bay lexicon, and, even understanding the kind of like discourse around architecture, right? And around observation and that kind of thing. So I think it's been, really, really fruitful and engaging and fulfilling, because it's just learning a different discipline, but also thinking really critically about all of these ideas, and understanding that, like with the LAC, the Landscape Architecture Fund, that we had a question, the question got pushed to the side, and we developed a new question, right? And that's kind of like speaking to like how good research happens, I think, right? That we have to be willing to let go of that perspective that we had, or that question, and just kind of move with the flow. So again, that time and the observation and observance of time.
Maybe one other thing that's worth saying is that the places we care about are very complicated, and one person can't understand a place by herself. And so something that is really a gift is to find people who will share their ways of understanding. And I feel like, so many people see the world in different ways. They see the same place from different viewpoints. They have different values and different hopes and different dreams. And as we think about change, which, we have to do, and we have to do with more and more urgency, not least because of the climate emergency. For me, the question as a designer is how to bring together a conversation among people who have different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing, to say, what is this place? Before we try to say, well, it ought to be like this, and it ought to be like that, or I have an idea, or all the things that, like, how well, maybe not in your design school, in the design school where I teach, and in the design school where I was a student, there was this idea like, okay, there's a problem, there's a brief, and there's a problem, and then there's a solution, or many solutions, as many solutions as there are people in the studio, let's say. And I feel like before we can even do that, it's really important to say, what is this place? You know, what is this place in a way that doesn't try to smash together understandings that are actually deeply different and valuable in their own terms. So caring about the people in those conversations, like I think that's huge.
Gonna run the mic around.
Hi, Jennifer and Jane. My name is Anmol. Um, I kind of like landscaping a lot and I tend to apply in my projects also. So my question is about downtown Toronto, where like we have totally lost every landscaping element, every landscaping story over there. So how we can revive that landscape story back in an area which is totally packed with high-rise buildings, especially if I talk about indigenous people who are suffering with chronic mental and physical health, how how it can be revived back. That will be my question.
I think one of the best things that we've seen happening in Toronto and around Toronto is the fact that youth are claiming back land. They're claiming back space. So like along the Humber River, there has been a lodge that has gone up and has been brought to life. And that has been going on now, I think maybe 5 to 7 years. But over the course of that time, it's just to see how it first began to where it is now, it's tremendous. And I think at some point, hopefully, we'll be able to share like photographs. We'll have to talk to the people who are at the forefront of that community. But it's interesting because it's not run by a not-for-profit. It's not overseen by government. It's just grassroots community. And people have been coming and going and developing their own relationships with the people who are there, and they're all making contributions. And so now they have like, they've planted medicine gardens, they've planted food gardens. There have been a couple of sweat lodges put up. There is a teaching lodge. And I guess I'm also happy to report I was part of was the fact that Dr. Debbie Daynard erected and brought to life a lodge at U of T, right? And so doing that, that was during 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And she didn't go to the provost and say, hi, can we put up a lodge? No, she just did it. And we had to stand beside her and help her to do that. So it's just this idea that people are enacting their rights as Indigenous people according to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which is that these are lands. These are, we can enact our culture, our ceremony, our ways of being. And so, you know, that's so fundamental because that lodge, the Mother Earth Teaching Lodge that went up at the New College Quad, I think that's the first lodge that's ever gone up, like that's been raised on U of T property, right? Right downtown U of T campus. As for the Humber River, when that first it began as a cleanup project, people were just down there cleaning up all the garbage and trying to restore and take care of the river, and then it started building out, and then they put up a lodge. Some elders came down to the space and they were saying that they felt the energy there and that it was like this feeling of like just overwhelming happiness, like that there was like this feeling that this space needed this, like it was a homecoming, right? That to have these lodges come back up. And that's saying something because I don't think that there has been a lodge raised on the Humber River in like 500 years, right? Ever since like the town of York got developed, like I don't think anyone has put a traditional lodge up on Humber River. So yeah, I think that's the best way I can respond to what you're saying, is that people are doing all of this work where they're lighting sacred fires and they're erecting lodges and they're having sweats and they're doing it, and they're not they're not asking for government permission. They're not seeking out not-for-profit funding to do the work or to build the lodge, right? They're actually doing it as a grassroots community. And I think that's part of the reason why we're thinking now, that all of these different wonderful land activism is happening, but where are they taking their direction from? Where is the guidance? And that's where this idea of, which I'm so happy to hear, is that when I've talked to elders and knowledge keepers now, they're saying we are looking at reigniting the council fires. And not just in specific communities, but reigniting them so that we first, as Indigenous nations, nation to nation, can revisit our wampum agreements, that we can fortify our protocols. And once that's done, then we can start to deal with settler colonial government. Right. And so I'm very hopeful for that. And so knowing that that's like on the ground movement is happening right now, that gives me a lot of hope.
I would say also, I don't think that there is no landscape in downtown Toronto. I think there's a landscape that's very much alive. And if we stop and pay attention, if we really think about observing in a serious way, there's a lot of evidence of it. It's funny because you can tell if you walk the streets where the creeks are, even if they're underground. It's quite possible to follow them. If you go down to the shore of Lake Ontario, you can still see the way sediment is transported by the counterclockwise currents in the lake. The birds are there, the trees are there, the dandelions are growing out of the cracks in the sidewalk. It rains, it snows, the wind blows. The presence of concrete does not mean the absence of life. We just might have to think about looking for it in a slightly different way. I think maybe that's worth saying too. I don't think there's I shouldn't say never. let's say I think all these beings and processes that are there, they have a lot of will and they have a lot of power, however many buildings there are.
Hi, thank you so much. So I have a question sort of related to this idea of everyone bringing their own perspective and how you asked many different questions and rephrased these questions, but then also worked with a lexicon on the railpath. So I'm sort of hearing that a lot of invisibilities came forth through this project, like thinking about like unearthing previous stories or like bringing those forward and maybe creating like rethinking what the lexicon can be. I mean, we studied the Bay lexicon in our previous course last summer, so I think we're all very familiar with it. But I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the invisibilities that came forth in your work together, or just through your like work in landscape, like in Toronto, whether those were like stories or I'm just, that's my question.
Well, that's a great question. What's your name?
I'm Valentina.
Valentina, okay. That's a really great question. I always think about a documentary photographer named Nicholas Nixon who wrote, because I read it, maybe he said it and somebody else wrote it down. He said, "The world is more interesting than anything I have to say about it." And that really stayed with me because I think there's so much to notice if we have the time and the attention, which are two precious commodities. But what, I mean, so many interesting stories came up. You know, Aaron made this fantastic atlas that looked through terrain modeling at the landform of the city. That was one of the first things we looked at all as a group. And from there, he did a really exhaustive study of the policy that had shaped that part of the city. And so suddenly all of the, you know, there were all kinds of stories about why things look the way they do now, you know, that were revealed by that very patient study and then recording. So that was a kind of an amazing series of discoveries. I feel like really, you know, each of the contributors brought forward something we didn't know. Grandmother Jacques and Jennifer helped us to understand the ice in a new way, in a different way. You know, like every week we would, Alex, you know, Alex had all kinds of stories about carbon and where it is and how we don't notice it and, you know, how its proportions change. Like, so I'm not trying to cop out of your question. I feel like the whole time, and I mean by that, I mean the time from the beginning of our conversations to get ready, there were all kinds of stories that came up, you know, stories about how to balance a cart on wheels, you know, that you could roll. Like, how do you manage that? Since Alex knew that because his grandfather had a push cart, you know, like so stories about people, stories about physics, stories about place, stories about mechanics. People would come on our walks and they would tell us, oh, you know, I have this association with this place, or I, you know, don't know this place, but I know this other place that I care about that's like this place. I feel like it's, you know, how sometimes when you start looking for something, it's everywhere. That's really how I feel like if you just kind of open the door, the question is not where are the stories, but the question of, you know, how do you even begin to pay attention and document all the stories that there are. Does that make sense? Is that an answer to your question?
Who was the person who did the landform, that first one with the blue you mentioned?
Aaron.
Aaron, yeah. And I just want to say, Valentina, that what I found when I saw that picture is that it really brought to life, you know, this idea of like when people say, you know, the land is alive, Mother Earth is like a living being. I looked at that picture and that, you know, first of all, just walking through Waterloo architecture, like it's just beautiful. Like when I see the way that architects and students print out their findings, like your posters, your printouts, they're all gorgeous. You should see in our department, it's like, it's just a disaster, but you come here and everything's so elegant and beautiful. But anyway, when I saw Aaron do his printout and it was big, huge poster, and I'm looking at it and it was all colored in blue, and there was nothing because it was the early first stages. So it looked like veins. It looked like blood. It looked like I was looking at the human body, except it was the land. And I thought that was so beautiful. And that spoke to me about this invisibility. Like we throw around these ideas, but when do you see these images and they really resonate? Like for me, that was a moment. And then the other thing I would say is like the invisibility. Like I think people would think asking the question, can kindness mitigate climate change? That probably sounds really like juvenile and kind of like silly. But when you think about it, if you show the same kindness to the planet that you show to your family, what would be the result of that? What is the result of having that much love and care that you would give to your own child, right? That you would give to the planet. And in that way, you could probably say, yeah, kindness can mitigate climate change, right? If we really thought about it in that way. So those are like those invisibilities and those aha moments that have come through this process for me. Much for the question.
Hi, thanks again for everything you said. I had a question for Jennifer. I'm really curious as to what sort of questions and conversations came up when you were thinking about translating what has been like very oral, place-based, kind of like physical Indigenous knowledge into the digital realm. And do you think this should or shouldn't be a larger movement of kind of digitization of Indigenous knowledge?
Question. I definitely think that digital bundles are so useful. When I look at think about fourdirectionsteachings.com. That project was launched in 2006. It's still used today. How many websites can you think about that were launched in 2006 that have that kind of longevity, right? And I think that, so when I went to go do my research and talk to people who use the site, that's how that book came about, a digital bundle, protecting and promoting Indigenous knowledge online, because you could see that people really valued having that, and that it was the Indigenous community across Canada that called it and recognized it as a digital bundle. I would never have come up with that. Like, it wasn't me, it was them. And so I accepted that as a gift and started working with how they said that, yeah, you putting that knowledge, like, that is a bundle, it's a gift. But then Cheryl LaRondelle turned around and really knocked me on my butt when she said, so what are you going to do when you're no longer around to take care of that? And that question really brought up the idea of like cultural transference and responsibility, and that, yeah, if something is sacred as like our knowledge bundles, and we see a digital bundle as a knowledge bundle, then yeah, this is a lifelong responsibility. And when I can no longer care for that site, I will have to go through some kind of protocol and ceremony to transfer that over to someone else to take care of it. So every time that these projects get developed, and especially when they're brought to life through ceremony, like the augmented reality piece you're going to see by Dr. Gokamish Jacques Lavalley, that too is a digital bundle because it's a teaching and it is from an elder, right? And so there's so much that I kind of learned just through process. And then, because I wasn't thinking when I first did the project, oh, what's going to happen when I no longer can take care of this website? I didn't even think this website was going to last this long to be. None of these thoughts came to me. Like, it's just only through living and being with the work that you start to see what comes out of it, right? You don't really think about that right off the top. I think with now when I think about digital bundles, I can tell you I gave a talk with CDHI, which is the Critical Digital Humanities Institute at U of T. I did that last fall. And I kind of went over all of the envelopes that are available through Canadian Heritage for digital production. Not a single one is devoted to Indigenous knowledge, which is really kind of heartbreaking, because if they would create that envelope, we could see how people having access to those kinds of funds could be creating these digital bundles. And when you create these digital bundles, everyone can then have access to them, right? And because they're created in ways where they are so imbued with the praxis of care, with so much love and so much like co-creation. So none of those things are, it's not like web art. It's not like by Jennifer. No, it's helper. Here's the elder, right? There's a different kind of relationship there. Does that answer some of what you were thinking about?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, watch for the question.
And while I was listening to the customer, it's the creation of this AR platform, in order to make human feels small, or is it an attempt to decenter the human, or to create an awareness of our monumental anthropological impact on the world? Or is this to allow us to imagine ourselves as giants, creating large scale change, or to remind us over a significant period of time.
Well, definitely not insignificance. But I think for grandmother Jacques, the way she shared the teaching, I think it really is about, and it speaks to what Jane Wolfe was sharing, that it's another perspective. It's a teaching. It's a story on the land and territory here, right? And so she's sharing that as a perspective that she learned through her family. And so I think it just adds to the many stories and perspectives on the land. And it's also definitely not to make anyone, like especially people, to feel small, but maybe for us to just question what it means to be in a relationship with the land, right? And so when you hear the teaching, you'll hear the way she speaks about that. What it means to like push that ice back. Because if we keep going the way we're going, well, we know the glaciers are melting, right? We know that we're going to get, huge amounts of displacement of water. Like it's all happening. Look at Venice, it completely dried up recently. Like there's just very strange things happening. So, and we have like thunder snow now, right? Which has been so bizarre this past month, thunder snow. So, I mean, I think that these are important teachings and they're important reflections, and that we have to, I think that when she was working with me on that, it was this thing to get people to start thinking differently, start thinking about what does it really mean to be kind, to the planet, and to take that kindness and do something with it, besides just creating a hashtag or something. Right? How do we actually do something productive?
Relationship between the plants and the digital in the conversation tonight. Like, for instance, when we were talking, Jennifer, about all of the sort of reinscribing of habits and experience within the city of Toronto, with we see sweat lodges and which, and I mean, and it's just kind of like it is in a way through that sort of being present in the city is in a way of remapping, and it's exponential, and it's not the sort of cartographic mapping. It kind of disrupts that, and I think that. I guess I'm thinking a little bit about how that is very place-based. And so one of my questions that I'm not even sure if I know how to word this exactly is around how the digital operates in that capacity. And I think recently, I know with students, we've had a lot of questions around this idea of the digital, like AI particularly, and care, and there seems to be sometimes we kind of come at a lot of sort of advanced digital techniques, maybe we as me, but with a kind of suspicion, right? And what I really love is how this project disrupts that expectation, and it offers digital media as another way to code, to map, and to describe a story, right? And it's a kind of a paradigm shift to me. And I see it even in, I think it was really super interesting when you talked about, and I'm about to paraphrase, so forgive me if I've somehow misunderstood this, but this is how I took it, as this kind of starting from like considering maintenance at the outset, like the maintenance of a website, who's going to maintain it, where is it going to end up, who, it's this, again, it reminds me again of what Jane was talking about earlier, is that there's this sort of temporal disruption, right? You're asking about the kind of who's taking care of this at the outset. And I think that there's something about that really disrupts our kind of our conventional kind of processes. So
with that in mind, I was really interested in well, two things. I guess the first is what, like, I mean, just kind of if you could expound a little bit about the role of digital media and in kind of making these disruptions, or being able to disrupt our kind of perceived conventional ways of being in the world. And yeah, I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think it was interesting because with fourdirectionsteachings.com, when that first launched, a lot of Indigenous people from across North America understood what the site was. Like they could read it as a knowledge site. But non-Indigenous people who came to the site, it went over their head. They did not get it. And in fact, one very, I'm not going to say who they are, but a renowned Canadian artist said to me, oh, they seem like folk stories. And it's like, no, they're more than folk stories, right? They're actual Indigenous knowledge teachings. And so, but that speaks to the lack of Indigenous knowledge education in our public schools and in our post-secondary institutions, that, non-Indigenous people can't recognize or read Indigenous knowledge when it's right in front of them, right? And so it's kind of like we're hiding in plain sight. And so I'm kind of hopeful that maybe AI won't be able to find us because we're hidden in plain sight, and they haven't quite figured out, AI hasn't quite figured out the vernacular yet, or the philosophy, or the knowledge paradigm. It doesn't really totally get it. So that's kind of good. And I did test it the other day with my 13-year-old. Let's ask AI to write a 500-page, essay, or I think we were goofing around on Indigenous knowledge, and what it came up with, I was like, so that was really good. But all that to say that with digital bundles, yeah, that, it has to be defined differently, because you notice how they're not digital stories. Right? We're moving away from digital storytelling, because digital storytelling is kind of like a TikTok, isn't it? Like you could tell a story about your day, you could tell a story about the meal you ate, you could tell a story about your dog, right? That is not a digital bundle. And so by having digital bundles exist, and we're carving out that space, we're naming it, we're defining it, we're kind of like, putting our stamp into this world of digital new media, and saying, we're not going to kind of fall into your what I was reading about called social activist genres on technology. Like we don't fit into the Commons project. We don't fit into the archive project. No, we're digital bundles. We're defining and naming ourselves, right? And we're saying that this is our vision for what this work is going to do. And these are the protocols that are attached to it. And so, yeah, I guess that's just the best way, that you're right. It's a completely different paradigm, and not everybody knows how to read it. And but Indigenous communities, whether they're people from the US who are Hopi, to the Haida, to the Dene, to the Mi'kmaq, they go and they get it. They know exactly what they're seeing as soon as they see it. But other people need to be, educated on how to understand these digital offerings, because it's just, we're hiding in plain sight.
One of the things that we've been talking a lot about with the class is has been this kind of question of where change happens in the world, and the relationship between the sort of idea of change happening systemically, incremental change, grassroots change. And I think that this talk tonight, and actually a lot of the talks in our series, have really foregrounded the power of grassroots change, or of incremental change. And when you were talking tonight, I mean, in both of your talks, and I'm even thinking specifically when you were talking about, again, what we see in the streets, like this kind of taking back of urban land.
we start to see change, and it happens, in some cases, we see it happening very slowly. One of the questions I have, though, is how do we know that change is happening? Like, how do we document it? And how do you, I guess, document it in your own work? And what were some of your goals around this kind of process of making change in this particular project?
No, Tara, thank you, because that's the question, isn't it? And it really is the question. It's complicated because most of the places that most of us know don't change because of design. They just absolutely don't, beyond a site scale. They aren't the way they are because of design. They are the way they are because of all the aggregated choices of people who live there, and sometimes because of things that people are absolutely not in charge of. So what was I going to start? My thought kind of switched gears halfway. I'm going to say two things. So I think changing hearts and minds is really important. It's really necessary. I knew an ecologist who used to say that paradigm shift happens one funeral at a time. And at whatever pace it's happening, I think grassroots change, incremental change is not going to be enough. But if there's enough grassroots demand, there will be policy change. So it seems to me like we don't have time to wait around for the structures of power to decide to do a better job. We just don't have that time. And I also think we can't absolve the structures of power from doing a better job. So I feel like we have to push from the bottom to get change at the top, because the kinds of transformations that we need right now in the face of the climate emergency and so many different questions of social justice and environmental justice demand big structural shifts. So I don't think it's either or. The question, I think the question of how do you know you're making a difference is a very interesting one, because I feel like what I would say is, at one scale, I mean, Jennifer, I don't know about you, but I would have to say I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And so the thing I chug along with is that if one person came on a walk with us and saw something she never saw before and understood a kind of meaning she never understood before, that's meaningful. If someone came and was part of the ceremony and saw the AR teaching and thought, wow, there's another way of understanding this world, that's a meaningful change. So I guess, again, in a funny way, we're back to the question of time.
I mean, I think for me, it's often comes as just, again, something I can't foresee, and it's a surprise. So with Four Directions teachings, when I was doing the research and interviewing for the book, one of the participants was John Burroughs. And John Burroughs is in the faculty of law, and he was teaching at University of Victoria. And he told me that he uses Four Directions teachings in all of his Indigenous law classes. And I was like very surprised. And he said, yeah, because, our teachings, Indigenous teachings, the ones that comes from our elders, knowledge keepers, they set the precedents for Indigenous law. And I was just like, again, this is another perspective of learning and thinking. And it was just so huge for me to hear that. And then over the years, I started seeing how people were using it in social work, like using this kind of teachings to better, train social workers, train with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in, the prison system, like just trying to do cultural awareness and do some kind of introduction into Indigenous worldview and knowledge. And I have to say that, when you hear that and then you see what people in the field are doing, it's phenomenal. So one thing you can, when you have time, is look up the fact that University of Victoria launched the world's first Indigenous law degree program. And John Burroughs was part of that. And so I'm just thinking, wow, like, really? Like in the 2000s, we finally got our first like Indigenous law program in the entire world. And that program is using this website that was made from 2006. So it's just kind of things that you just, truth is stranger than fiction. You could never have thought it. You could never have begun to even imagine that that could have an impact. And it did. And it's wonderful. And that's where you just feel so much gratitude and say, wow, like this is the work that needs to continue. Digital bundles need to continue. English.
Great. I think it would be, first of all, thank you so much for everything tonight. It was wonderful. I wonder if it would be interesting or useful to leave the students with the link, or everybody here in the audience with the link, so that there's an opportunity for everybody to leave the lecture hall and interact with the project.
Sure, yeah, or you can also just go to Invert Media, so INVERT media.com, and it's right on the homepage, the link.
And is there any sort of words of guidance that you'd like to offer to the audience before they engage with the project?
Yeah, just go outside if you can. It'll be, I think, more impactful than being in a room. Go outside, have earbuds or your earphones on if you can, because the sound is really nice, and face north. And think about where that ice ridge ended. Maybe it came out this far. I have no idea.
I think it would be really, really amazing if you had an opportunity to do this right after this lecture. Thinking of us all sort of doing this as a community, I think that would be a really great thing. I will do it myself. And again, thank you so much, Jane and Jennifer.
Thank you.